And I'm here with Elias Rosario, our engineer and co-host, and with Michael Bielawa from last season. Welcome to season number 2.
Thank you, Frank. Hey, Elias.
Hey, Mike Bielawa.
And so, Michael, we invited him back. You know him as an author and a Bridgeport Public Library person who has been kind enough to join us and talk about these interesting aspects. Last year, he talked about Albert Bender and Men in Black and all that exciting stuff, right?
Yeah, Albert Bender, the UFO.
That's right. Yeah,
Men in Black phenomenon in Bridgeport. Not something that not too many people know about.
that's where it all started. That worldwide phenomenon, right in downtown Bridgeport.
So he's back, and I guess we just wanted to have a little conversation here about whatever you want to talk about, but more importantly, I think you were talking about the exciting and interesting aspect of Jack the Ripper.
Well, as some of you can see, for those that are watching this on YouTube or any other visual medium, we have Mike Bielawa's Wicked Bridgeport book here, and the room is appropriately colored in red because today we are talking about Jack the Ripper. And Mike Bielawa has an interesting story as to, how that relates to Bridgeport. And I'm curious to know because I never heard about it.
Jack the Ripper, there's as morbid as it sounds, and there's a worldwide fascination with the Ripper crimes. And he had murdered 5 prostitutes in Whitechapel section of London in 1888 and then vanished. Mm-hmm. The murders remain unsolved. Mm-hmm. Folks who have continued to study the research into the crimes and possible suspects of Jack the Ripper are called ripperologists. And some of them have compiled lists. Some of the lists are not exhaustive. A dozen real hardcore possibilities to up to 20, 25 individuals who are on the spectrum of possibly being Jack the Ripper. And one of those individuals has a Bridgeport connection. And that all ties in with 2 murders that took place in Lower Manhattan, in kind of the seedy seaside section of the Lower East Side.
What years are we talking about?
The Jack the Ripper again in London, 1888.
Okay.
There was a murder that opened up a lot of eyes and created a lot of interest in Jack the Ripper in 1891 in Manhattan. Mm-hmm. A prostitute was murdered and then mutilated exactly as the fashion of the Whitechapel crimes. And her name was Carrie Brown. She was a prostitute, and her street name was Old Shakespeare. She was an alcoholic, and when she drank to excess, she would quote the bard. She would quote Shakespeare. 12 years later, Sarah Martin was found a block away in a rundown hotel known to be visited by just street folks, sailors, transients. And she was found murdered in a bed in that room December 19th, 1903. So 12 years later. And they pieced it together that they asked witnesses who Sarah Martin may have been seen with in the company of, and it turned out to be a fellow who signed a register under Carl Nielsen or Carl Nelson. And that's all they had, except when the police scoured the room at that hotel, they found a package wrapped in brown paper, and there were an old pair of shoes were in that package with the name on the outside, Fred Bellino. And so they said, well, maybe this character who's a person of interest is Fred Bellino. How are we ever going to find him? It's 1903. There was a receipt in the shoebox that had Miggs and Company from downtown Bridgeport. So detectives left Manhattan. They were sent to Bridgeport. They interviewed the Miggs clerks, and they remembered this fellow, intimate details about him, because he was a really interesting individual. He had come in disheveled as a sailor, and he had said he needed new clothes and new shoes, and his shoes had been cobbled together because he had really bad corns on his right foot. So he fixed his own shoes. He got a new pair. He'd have to repair them to fit his shoe size with his health problems. And he shared a story about being shipwrecked. And so the clerks remembered him. The police asked, well, Fred Bellino, we don't know, but he was a sailor. So they went to Bridgeport Harbor. And what they found out that Fred Bellino wasn't a human. Fred Bellino was the name of a ship. They went to the captain of the ship, and they remembered a Carl Nielsen or Nelson leaving for New York just a few days before. They put two and two together. They had stakeout throughout the docks in lower Manhattan, and they found him at one of the sailors' unions where individuals would go to sign aboard different ships. They'd look for jobs there. And they arrested this fellow, Carl Nielsen, and he said he didn't know anything about Sarah Martin. He was never in that hotel. He was never in that part of New York. He was enjoying the fireworks that evening. There was a big firework display in Manhattan. And he said his birth name was Emil Totterman. That was his real name. He said, sometimes I used Carl Nelson. That was my mom's maiden name. And he went to trial. And they found that he was guilty and that he was sentenced to the electric chair. They sent him off to Sing Sing.
Now, this is Totterman.
This is Emil Totterman.
Emil Totterman.
They found that the gentleman was guilty. They brought in the clerks from Miggs and Company. They on the witness stand. They had the folks from the hotel who had seen him come in with Sarah Martin, the prostitute, and the owner of the hotel, the wait staff. They all recognized him and pointed him out in the courthouse that he was the same man, Carl Nielsen, was Emil Totterman. Sentenced to the electric chair. And within a month, his sentence was commuted because of he was a sailor in the Spanish-American War and was a hero in one of the battles off of Cuba on the USS Iowa.
In 1898.
Correct. Now, he went to Sing Sing. Now, removed from death row, he would serve a life sentence. He escaped from Sing Sing.
Really?
He escaped from Sing Sing in 1916.
Which is in Ossining, New York, right?
Not far away.
Right around here.
And when he escaped, the Bridgeport authorities were besides themselves because they thought that he might come back for revenge. To the witnesses, or he was familiar with the city. He may set up a home base here. Not that anybody saw him here, but there are two unsolved murders that had to do with sexual assault and mutilation of a man and a young boy in Bridgeport during the 18 months of Emil Totterman's escape. He was captured eventually in April 1917 in Buffalo and brought back to Sing Sing. From there on, he was a model prisoner. In fact, he was cheered some years later. It was 1927. Easy to remember because the 1927 Yankees.
Yep.
He was cheered when the American flag became dislodged on the giant flagpole at Sing Sing. And being a sailor and used to being up in the masts, he climbed up. It was a dangerous thing to do, but he climbed the flagpole and reassembled the American flag, and the prisoners all cheered him. And he had said he did it for the World War I veterans who were incarcerated. He became a local hero in the prison, both to the inmates and the guards because of that. Some years, well, not too much later, I'm guessing 1929 it may have been, he eventually was pardoned. They said the evidence that he was convicted on was circumstantial and that he was intoxicated at the time. So it wouldn't have been murder one. Could have been murder 2 or 3 or even manslaughter. Well, the governor of New York figured there was enough that weighed in his favor that Emil Totterman was released, and he returned to Finland, where he was from, and was never heard from again.
He was released?
Released from Sing Sing, 1929.
And what was the reasoning again?
That there wasn't enough evidence, concrete evidence. They felt that it was circumstantial.
You mean they retried?
It was a governor's pardon.
Oh.
They approached the governors with the paperwork.
So you can do that?
Yes.
You can undo a conviction?
As the governor of the state, yes, or the president. This was a full pardon. And what's a really interesting side fact about it is that governor was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So FDR pardoned Emil Totterman, who, possibly could have been Jack the Ripper based on the other.
Let's go
MO.
back.
There's a lot to cover.
You just covered a lot.
Yeah, it's a
so here we are in
convoluted story.
1888, and these are these murders in London.
Yes.
And that's, by the way, the same year this building was built.
Oh, wow.
So 1888, right? This is the Victorian era.
It's a beautiful home.
And thank you. And, the P.T. Barnum is old at this point. Gustav Whitehead is starting to build an airplane. That's right. Things are starting. This is like an industrial capital.
Definitely.
So people would leave. So they never found, they had about 20 different suspects, you're saying, in London.
Yes.
They never found Jack the Ripper.
That's correct.
and there is a reason to believe, because I'm going to try to walk you through this, connect the dots. There's a reason to believe he may have fled London and gone to another country like the United States?
Because the murders abruptly ceased in London, they thought that either A, he might have just stopped his behavior, he could have died, or he could have been incarcerated, or he could have left the country. There was something that just stopped it completely.
So the assumption we're taking is that maybe he left the country.
That's correct, because at the same time that he left the country, and the Brown murder case was being investigated in 1891 in Manhattan.
Okay, before you go there,
I was going to say that newspapers, whenever this happened, they all announced that the Ripper was back and now in America.
Okay, but before you go there, this boat that you were talking about.
Sure.
What was it called?
The Bellino, the Fred Bellino.
Fred Bellino. Is there any manifest or anything that suggests it went from London to the United States?
It's a great question. Not directly. It was coming up and down the coast of the United States. It was a coastal schooner and would just bring supplies, lumber, metals, whatever, raw supplies from port to port. And they were delivering lumber to the Fairest Ironworks at the bottom of East Main Street in Bridgeport, on the other side, the eastern side from downtown in Bridgeport Harbor. So at the bottom of East Main, it's now...
Steel Point.
Yes, exactly. It's on the edges of Steel Point was the Fairest Mills.
So the Fairest Mills. Now, this boat could have come from New York City or something like that, or somewhere else.
It could have been, I think that it was from Maine.
Maine. Okay.
The port was Maine where it left.
So the only assumption we're making that we don't know about is, what was his real name? Eddie?
Emil Totterman.
Emil Totterman may have been on a boat from London to somewhere in the United States, but we don't have any manifest to suggest that.
No, there's not a manifest from London to the New World. There were thoughts that he had vanished so abruptly that he may have been aboard ship. That was an idea that was examined at the time in 1888. So from 1888 to the Brown murder in 1891 in a sailor's resort, a sailor's hotel, where the prostitute was murdered in 1891. The Bridgeport murder was where he was found. The trail led to Bridgeport in 1903. So London, 1888. A sailor's resort, a place where sailors would frequent. So most likely a sailor had committed the 1891 Carrie Brown murder. And in the same neighborhood, 12 years later, 1903, Emil Totterman was found with the person who was murdered.
But the boat that came to where
Bridgeport.
Steel Point is today,
yes.
What year was that?
1903.
So that was after 1891.
Well, yeah, he would, and as a sailor, he could have left London after 1888, and he definitely was a sailor during the Spanish-American War. And Frank, you mentioned 1898, and so he was aboard a battleship. So by the late 1890s, he was already established as a sailor. Was he a sailor all his life? He had pretty much said that's what he had done, was kicked around as a sailor. Right. And he was born in Finland and then was known as an American sailor.
Now, do you think his arrival, Emil Totterman, his arrival in Bridgeport, do you think that has something to do with maybe things that were going on in Bridgeport around those times, like 1880, 1888? Because I'm looking in your book, and I can't help but notice this one gentleman, the Strange Notebook of Dr. George Porter. Oh. He was a reanimator.
That's a great story.
Maybe did Emil Totterman, a.k.a. Jack the Ripper, possibly hear stories about this area and all the industrious kind of happenings that were happening, plus maybe some wicked things, and said, I probably need to go there.
You've connected a lot of different dots, and there's the reanimation story with Dr. Porter, with his attempts to reanimate humans. They were executed criminals.
You mean like Dr. Frankenstein?
Exactly, with the same type of technology, with galvanism through electricity. And he did those experiments at the North End jail. They were well reported in New York City newspapers and medical journals.
So the world knew.
Yes,
a good amount of the world knew.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, would that have brought person with that morbid, bent, you never know. It's a very real possibility. What we know brought him here was the industry, the Ferrous Iron Works, but also this was an armaments giant. We were at one point the world's leading manufacturer of shells for artillery and rifles, pistols, the world's leader, and so vital during World War I and World War II. We were already involved with the armaments industry through a UMC.
Do we know
in
that
Remington?
Do we know that Emil was in London?
That we don't know. That hasn't been yet corroborated. We don't know yet. And if he was what name was he using? And the one thing that folks will always try to figure out is they have a rough idea of when Emil was born, and then they try to match up the dates of how old the Jack the Ripper London suspect may have been, how old he may have been, as opposed to how old Emil was. And there's been a variety of dates given to the birth of Jack the Ripper, ranging from the 1860s through 1870, and even I don't understand how it could be as a young teenager giving the birth date of 1875, birth year. That would make him just 13, 14 years old.
Too young.
Maybe too young.
Yeah.
But Emil said that when he was in prison, he filled out paperwork for World War I, his draft papers. And plus that he was a veteran, so he filled out the papers and he put down a birthday year of 1870, which would have made him 18 in 1888. Outside possibility, but still, a young adult. Could it have been him if he was 18 or if he was fibbing and was really 20 years old? They figure that the Jack the Ripper suspect may have been in his young 30s, his early 30s. So there's the outside possibility of the years that he was born, what happened, and that there's a possibility of these two murders, one definitely being associated with Emil Totterman. It's interesting because the 1891 murder, an individual, a Muslim individual from North Africa was arrested and sentenced to life in prison in a mental institution. After a few years, the same thing occurred. He was released. Circumstantial evidence that there wasn't enough to pin the crime on this gentleman, and they let him out of the asylum, the mental asylum in New York State. My question, in addition to everything we're talking about, is if these two fellows didn't kill these two women, then who did? And who did? And it is on the fringe of reality, but there is that Jack the Ripper connection, especially the 1891 murder, which mirrored the atrocities in London.
What was the shop again that you said that there was a there was a box and that had connection to a Bridgeport shop? What would that shop be today, and where would it be?
Miggs and Company was a very popular clothing store, and they are located on Main Street, kitty corner from the Holiday Inn, and across from
it's a major corner.
Yes,
You're
across
talking where Rite Aid was?
Where Rite Aid was, on the corner of Main Street and Fairfield Avenue.
Yeah, near the courthouse.
Exactly. It would be the northwest corner, across from the courthouse, and kitty corner from today's Holiday Inn. And there's the restaurant on the corner there, Funchals. It's across the street from there, where Rite Aid was.
Right.
That was Miggs and Company, and it was a major attraction. And the police from New York, the detectives were surprised that the clerks remembered this fellow because it was right during the middle of the holiday rush.
Yeah.
And there were lots of customers. And how could you be so sure to have remembered this fellow? And there's too many unique characteristics about his dress, his story, the odd shoes that he had
he stood out.
put together. He definitely stood out.
Yeah. Hey, that spot is right next to the new karaoke spot opening up soon.
Yeah, right.
It's right next door.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating because, I worked retail for a long time, and there have been a few odd cases of customers, but this guy must have really definitely stuck out. With what's up with the with the family of those clerks and all that stuff throughout the years? Has their stories been passed down? And my father used to work at this spot, and he said that he might have saw Jack the Ripper. Anything like that?
It's a great question, and I wrote the Bridgeport Public Library historical collections were kind enough to allow me a lot of space to put together a very thorough report on the Jack the Ripper, and it's on their the Bridgeport Public Library's homepage, the historical collections section, and on the homegrown historians, and they could find it under the Jack the Ripper Visit Bridgeport, Connecticut. All of that is there, including the clerk's name. I did look up their information, what biographical information in the city directories to find out that they were Bridgeport residents, that they did live locally. But beyond that, I just wanted to establish that they were actually clerks, that these were their correct names in the New York and Bridgeport papers. I was really focused on who was Fred Bellino, and then, of course, alias Carl Nielsen, alias Emil Totterman.
Mm-hmm.
So just to put a context to the whole thing, 1888, murders stop in London. 1991, murder here in the United States.
1891.
What did I say?
You said 1991.
Oh, 1891, yeah. There was murders in 1991 too, but 1891, there was a murder here in New York.
Yes.
And then one in Bridgeport.
The evidence, the 1903 murder in Manhattan led to his conviction through evidence in Bridgeport.
Evidence in Bridgeport.
That was
no murder
1903.
actually in Bridgeport.
That's correct. He entered from out of state through Bridgeport and took the train to Manhattan.
Do we know where he lived here in Bridgeport?
He was a transient.
Transient.
And that just aboard ship.
Okay.
He didn't spend a lot of time in Bridgeport. Ironically, and I mean morbidly, sadly, Carl, oh my goodness. Anybody could look him up because he's totally overlooked as one of the world's greatest mass murderers. And he did spend time in Bridgeport. Oh, goodness. Elias, do you know the name Carl Prodzam or Prodzam?
What years?
1920s, around that point,
Okay.
and earlier. And that's why I'm wondering if there's a possibility of connecting him to those two unsolved murders, because they were of a sexual assault nature and they were mutilations. And Carl, his last name began with the letter P, like Peter. Carl focused on young men, and he preyed on young men and would often, in Manhattan, meet them at the sailors' resorts, the hotels, bring them, rape them, kill them, and bring them out to Execution Rocks on Long Island Sound and drop their bodies. He did spend time in Bridgeport. He spent time in jail in Bridgeport. He was caught here for a burglary, I believe, at a jewelry store. I can't yet find evidence of it in the newspapers. He mentions it in his memoirs.
Well, it's a big city, so people
it's
are
a big
coming in
city.
and out. And
There's a lot of petty crime.
yeah. And so you have this guy who ended up in the Spanish-American War,
Yes, going back to Emil.
went back to jail, was liked because of his character, what he did,
Yes.
and was eventually released after one escape. And then how did he die?
No one knows. He returned after FDR pardoned him as governor of New York. He returned to Finland, and all trace of him is lost. He just vanished as abruptly as Jack the Ripper.
So this will be part of Bridgeport's fables for years to come.
It's a story on the fringe, but what's very eerie about it is that list, even if it was 100 individuals long, includes a person who could have been Jack the Ripper, and he has a very definite Bridgeport connection.
And a style that was similar to Jack the Ripper's.
Very similar. Very similar. That's what headlines across the country announced, that Jack the Ripper's returned. He's been found in America. So they knew immediately from prostitutes, the sexual focus, the deviant focus of the murders, and the mutilation, that organs removed, just as in the London situations. And in fact, the court during the 1903 trial for Emil Totterman, they had said on the female body, they were in regions that we will not mention for decorum's purposes. Again, mirroring the Jack the Ripper atrocities.
Wow. So the world, as Elias suggested earlier, was aware this was a news event. Today it would be on social media, it would be on CNN, it would be
yes.
big news.
It would have been on just not the news stations and the news channels for a long time to come, but it would also have been on any kind of cable programs that are unsolved crimes, serial killers.
So how can he get off if the speculation was that maybe he would? How the heck does that happen?
It is so strange.
What governor would do that and expect to be president?
That whole connection with FDR is wild, and I have no idea what his attorneys would have brought to have them change their opinion.
Of someone who was so well known or
Exactly.
infamous.
They relied on the fact that he was, in later years, a model prisoner, and that he had been a American war hero. He had received recognition from the United States Congress for his duty during under fire in the Spanish-American War. Those things weighed heavily in his favor, but just to go from everything they proved in court and then just to throw that out of the door and say, well, the evidence is circumstantial and that he was intoxicated at the time, he hasn't shown any violent tendencies. Well, he served his time, let him go. It's very strange.
You know, Bridgeport has those stories, like on Arch Street behind the Majestic and Palace when the priest was shot in the back of the head. Do you know?
Yeah,
I don't know if we have time to talk about those issues, or are we going to come back and talk about that? I love the reanimation story.
Yeah.
Wow, these are some fascinating
And
things.
the reanimation story was well known. And as a teaser about the doctor in the reanimation was that Dr. Porter, he had carried with him a secret. Now, everybody hears about conspiracies and government conspiracies, and everybody mostly writes them off. He said that he had a secret concerning the Lincoln assassination that he would take to the grave with him, that it was such a secret he could let nobody know. Well, eventually, because the New York Times and a lot of people were telling stories about the Lincoln assassination and information came out subsequent decades later, he had to go and tell the public what he knew about hiding the body of John Wilkes Booth and where John Wilkes Booth was really buried, and that it was a dummy corpse that the government was handling and publicly hiding. It was Bridgeport's Dr. Porter who was in charge of hiding the actual remains of Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth. And these weird stories.
Is this a real story or conspiracy?
Absolutely true. Absolutely.
Oh, this is absolutely true.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's another Bridgeport connection.
Absolutely.
And that Arch Street story, just tell people briefly.
The priest, and oh goodness gracious, his last name again began with the letter L. Laramie. The priest left the theaters on Main Street, just above Arch. The theaters aren't there anymore, but that was our theater district. He left the theater on a crowded night. The theater goers were all leaving. Main Street was filled with people. A fellow walked up behind him and shot him in the head, as Frank said, and killed this priest in front of dozens, perhaps hundreds of witnesses, and nobody could identify the person. And eventually somebody was arrested, and the DA was, the name was Cummings.
Who was prosecuting it.
Who was prosecuting the case. And he took the evidence and turned and said, I can't prosecute this man because there's not enough evidence. And that suspect walked. Another unsolved, very famous murder
And they made a
case,
movie out of it.
Boomerang, with Dana Andrews. And Cummings went on to become another FDR connection. He became the United States Attorney General.
Bridgeport has great stories.
Under FDR. Oh, there's so many stories.
And what about Nancy? I was looking in your book, and Nancy Guilford, anytime she was around, young women would die or something like that. And she was eventually caught in London.
Yeah.
So what is it with Bridgeport in London?
That was the place that Nancy Guilford, she had a medical practice in New Haven and then had served time in prison for abortions gone wrong, where her patient subsequently died. Well, it was in Bridgeport when another young lady died in her care, and then she dismembered the body. Had she passed? Was she going to die? She was kept incarcerated.
And that happened here?
In Guilford's house, across the street from the library, the downtown library. And they eventually found the head. Boys found the head in a creek that feeds the Yellow Mill.
That's near Albert Bender's house.
Exactly.
Norman Bender.
It's on the same block.
Yeah.
Nancy Guilford's house was on one end of the block, and Albert Bender's house was on the other end. So when I do the ghost tours, the wicked walks every October, I say Bridgeport has to be one of America's most haunted downtowns. Absolutely hands down.
And everything's next to each other. It's dense.
Everything is
Densely
just
packed
within a
together.
few blocks. I mean, possibly Jack the Ripper, the Men in Black sightings first here, Nancy Guilford. And when she did run from the police, she ran to New York. She escaped to Canada. She escaped to London, Liverpool, then London, then Paris, and eventually Scotland Yard arrested her. It was a worldwide suspect hunt. And they tracked her down back in London. They returned her to Bridgeport for trial, and where she was found guilty. And these body parts of her victim were turning up just in a branch of water off of the Yellow Mill Bridge area. It's all filled in now. But,
do you mind returning one day so we can continue talking about these things?
I would love to. You guys are, really fascinating to speak with about this, and your knowledge about it is so solid. I love sharing this dialogue.
I've got one last question for you in terms of, as it pertains to everything in this book, everything we've talked about now, everything we talked about in the last show. Considering how downtown Bridgeport is one of the most haunted downtowns anywhere, do you think that at some point in history, one thing happened which spawned everything else to follow? Yeah. And if so, what was that one thing that just kind of like cursed it?
That solidified all this bizarre paranormal behavior. Because again, Bridgeport is one of America's most paranormal downtowns, hands down. And somebody said, well, it's not all ghosts and hauntings. Well, no, it isn't. But there's some kind of vibe. If you're having the Men in Black, the main library is supposed to be haunted. You have that decapitation murder with Nancy Guilford across the street, Guilfoyle across the street from the library. All of this going on. And lots of folks on the tours and lots of folks who will approach me during my author talks about that. I really can't pin it on any one item. I do have some ideas that deal with early Native American rights.
So maybe it was the earliest thing that ever happened.
Listen. When they put the railroad through in 1845, they dug up on the Bridgeport-Stratford line in the area where St. Michael's Cemetery is. So, I mean, it was
Indian burial ground?
A summering site for Native Americans.
For Native Americans.
Now, what the railroad workers were really superstitious on one hand and just very nervous about. They just didn't want to dig up graves. I mean, it's just a disrespect for the deceased. Mm-hmm. But they were finding Indian burials all along the railroad tracks where they dug. But what a lot of folks, maybe nobody realizes, that they dug up a stone ring, a stone column, like imagine Stonehenge, but on a smaller scale, on the Bridgeport-Stratford line. Now, what is a stone ring doing here? The stones were cut. They weren't. It wasn't a natural phenomenon, and they were in a circle. They were pillars, stone columns in a ring.
Wow.
I'm always trying to think, what did that have to do? Folks interpreted it in the 19th century as a medicine wheel. Whatever it might be for healing, whatever it is, it's a sacred site. And what was this kind of focus, sacred or religious focus, in the Bridgeport area? And then all these other things are happening, not just in Bridgeport, but next door in Stratford, too. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of hauntings in Stratford.
Let's leave it there, because that's a great place to leave it.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that question. Wow, that was great. All right, well, thanks, Michael, and we'll see you again soon, hopefully. Maybe we'll bring you back for the end of the second season or the beginning of the third season, if that's okay with you.
Anytime. I love coming on the air with you folks.
And I want to thank the sponsors who continue to join us. And we'll see you soon. Welcome again to Bridgeport Stories.